The last thing Corazon heard before her life turned upside down was a gentle knock on the door. Little did anyone know that the man behind the door was the violent murderer Richard Speck. With a .22 caliber pistol and a hunting knife in hand, Speck proceeded to take everyone in her house captive. All she could do was watch as he slowly killed each and every one of her friends. Hello and welcome back. We often hear lots of stories about killers and the heinous crimes they commit. You know what we don't hear enough about? The powerful survivors who clutched their safety from the jaws of death. So today, I won't be talking too much about Richard Franklin Speck, the hormone-abusing, drug-abusing, mass-murdering drifter. No, I'll be talking about the nurse whose quick thinking and survival skills kept her alive in the face of certain death. So if you enjoy my video, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel for more stories like this to be injected straight into your YouTube feed. I'm your host, Greenman, and this is the Murder Encyclopedia. It was a seemingly ordinary day in mid-July 1996. Corazon had just finished her shift as a nurse at the South Chicago Community Hospital, where she worked tirelessly to care for her patients. Like clockwork, she followed her routine of washing her clothes and writing letters to her family back in the Philippines. As the clock neared 10:30 p.m., Corazon retired to her room in the townhouse she shared with other nurses. Their lives may have been filled with early mornings and long shifts, but there was a sense of peace in their routines. Little did they know that this night would shatter that peace in the most horrifying way imaginable. But first, let's back up a bit. Who is Corazon Amorao? She was born and raised in Batangas, Philippines. Corazon grew up in a modest family of 8 children. Despite her 4'11" frame, Corazon was far from easily intimidated, and she quickly gained a reputation for her grit and ability to adapt to challenging circumstances. This is foreshadowing. She was quite the hardworking student in her youth, and after completing her early education at Far Eastern University in Manila, Corazon pursued a career in nursing. With her nursing degree in hand, she decided to embark on a new chapter in her life, one that would take her thousands of miles away from her homeland to the United States. It was the 1960s, a time when the United States was facing a shortage of healthcare staff, and Filipino exchange nurses like Corazon were in high demand. She, along with 2 other Filipino nurses, Valentina Pasion and Merlita Gargulo, made the life-changing decision to work in Chicago, pursuing better wages to support their families back in the Philippines. And so together, these 3 women, along with 6 others, worked long hours as nurses and shared sleeping quarters in a townhouse. The exact townhouse a very inebriated and violent drifter named Richard Speck was about to invade. Here's a little context on just who Richard Speck was. Well, first and foremost, he was a very unstable man. Born on December 6, 1941 in Monmouth, Illinois, Speck's formative years were marked with a tumultuous family life and an adolescence characterized by delinquency and drinking, including arrests for burglary, theft, and dropping out of high school at 16. Speck's criminal activities escalated as he got older, leading to his imprisonment in 1963 for various offenses, including robbery. It was during his time behind bars that he began displaying violent tendencies and an unsettling fascination with deviant sexual behavior. Once he was out, he sexually assaulted and robbed a 65-year-old woman and then ran out of town. Fleeing from his numerous crimes, Speck settled into a Skid Row hotel near the National Maritime Union hiring hall, where he applied for work as a merchant seaman. Unfortunately for everyone involved in this story, the townhouse where Corazon and her colleagues stayed was close by, and Richard Speck was well aware of their presence. On July 13, 1966, Corazon heard a soft knock on the door. Sure, it was almost 11 o'clock at night, but that was nothing out of the ordinary. After all, some of her colleagues were still out on the town. So Corazon did what most would do. She opened the door and came face to face with Richard Speck. He was armed with a .22 caliber pistol and a hunting knife. He forced his way into the living quarters and violently took control. He forced all the nurses into a room and bound them with strips of fabric torn from their bedsheets. Corazon and her friends, Passion and Merlita, were tied up. But they weren't the only ones in this perilous situation. 3 other nurses, Patricia Matusik, Pamela Wilkening, and Nina Schmale, had been asleep when Speck arrived. And well, to put it simply, they woke up to a living nightmare. They were now in the hands of a ruthless killer. Corazon wasn't about to give in to this waking nightmare, so she and her friends plotted their escape. Taking advantage of Speck's clearly drunk and disoriented state, they discreetly loosened their bonds and escaped, hiding under the beds. The 3 hid in a tiny bedroom, close to where they heard the muffled cries of their colleagues echoing in the townhouse. This is where the story took a bit of a twist. There were 9 women who stayed in that townhouse. 3 of them were bound, 3 of them were free and hiding in a bedroom, and the final 3 just walked in through the front door and came face to face with Richard Speck. They were unsurprisingly completely oblivious to what on earth was happening. Of course, Corazon could only hide and see how things would turn out. But the next thing that happened was surprising, to say the least. Corazon and her friends heard the sound of one of the returning nurses urging them to please come out, that Speck meant no harm. Apparently, Speck had manipulated them into thinking he just needed money to travel to New Orleans. Well, Corazon wasn't buying it. The thought that the man armed to the teeth, the man that had just tied everyone up, was simply a harmless drifter, that was a tall order. Unfortunately, Corazon's friends weren't as skeptical as she was, and they were successfully lured out, leaving Corazon alone. The fate that awaited these women was nothing short of tragic. All 8 nurses were corralled into a room and tied up. For the next 4.5 hours, they watched as Speck led them out one by one in 20 to 30 minute intervals, each woman forced to wait their turn as the person beside her got murdered. One by one, he would stab and strangle each nurse to death. Corazon could not see exactly how Speck killed her colleagues, but their muffled screams and cries were more than enough. After Speck left the scene sometime past 3 a.m., Corazon remained hidden under the bed until 6 a.m., ensuring he was truly gone. When she finally emerged, the scene in front of her was horror, true horror. The bodies of her friends and colleagues were right in front of her. Corazon climbed up to an upstairs window and screamed for help. "They are all dead! My friends are dead! Oh God, I'm the only one alive!" She had made it. She had survived. Speck, on the other hand, was trying to do the opposite. In the aftermath of the heinous crimes, he attempted to escape the weight of his actions by trying to take his own life. However, fate intervened, and he was apprehended by the police and rushed to Cook County Hospital for treatment. Speck was brought to court to face his crimes, and Corazon Amara was determined to see justice served. She boldly testified at Speck's trial, recounting the horrors of that night with unwavering resolve. When asked if she knew who had killed her fellow student nurses, she calmly got up, walked across the courtroom floor, and stood before Speck. Her index finger almost touching his nose, she said firmly, "This is the man." Corazon's story was and remains very inspirational. She was unsurprisingly contacted by multiple notable publishers trying to buy her story, but she simply told them, "It is my desire to make clear that the memory of my dear colleagues is of such character that I do not want to have it tainted by the acceptance by me of money or any other personal benefit." As for Speck, well, Corazon's testimony coupled with his fingerprints found at the scene left no room for doubt. On April 15th, the jury unanimously found him guilty of all 8 murders, and he was sentenced to death. Throughout the investigation, Speck claimed to have no recollection of the gruesome murders, yet psychiatric evaluations proved he was indeed very sane when he committed those heinous murders. He was diagnosed as a sociopath, devoid of empathy and consumed by a sinister nature. Years later, Speck was asked why he did it. Showing no remorse, he said, "It just wasn't their night." When asked how he felt about the murders after all these years, he said, "Like I always felt. Had no feeling. If you're asking me if I felt sorry, no." In 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court abolished capital punishment, and Speck's death sentence was commuted to a maximum of 1,200 years in prison. He spent the remainder of his life in prison, where he died of a heart attack in 1991. No one showed up to claim his body. Not long after, Corazon Amara went home to the Philippines and married lawyer Alberto Atienza. Eventually, she and her family moved back to the U.S. to Washington, D.C., where she spent most of her time until retirement, serving as a nurse at the Georgetown University Hospital. Now 79, Corazon is now a grandmother and reportedly still keeps in touch with the victims' families, occasionally. This is one of those rare happy endings when it comes to killers like Richard Speck. If you like survival stories, then I've got just what you need. Click the video on screen and check out my video on the incredible women who survived Ted Bundy. If you enjoyed watching, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more content, because there's a lot more where this came from, here at the Murder Encyclopedia.